the desert was a canvas of ochre and rust, a vast and unforgiving masterpiece painted by a sun that knew no mercy, a celestial sovereign that reigned with an unchallenged and incandescent fury. It was a land of sharp edges and whispered legends, where the wind spoke in a language older than man, a sibilant, ghostly tongue that carved the sandstone into haunting cathedrals of stone and silence. Here, the mountains stood like silent, brooding gods against an endless turquoise sky, their craggy faces a testament to eons of indifferent observation. In this crucible of heat and silence lived a young woman named Leanne, a soul spun from two different threads of the world, a living tapestry of divergent origins. Her father's spirit was of the East, a land of jade rivers and whispered poetry, of ancestors whose memories were as sacred as the temples they built. Her heart, however, was tethered to this harsh, beautiful wilderness where she was born, a place that sang a different, wilder song. She belonged to neither world, and yet to both, a solitary bridge between the quiet reverence of her heritage and the unyielding reality of the frontier. She walked the arid land with a grace that defied its brutality, her knowledge of its secrets a quiet inheritance, a language learned not from books but from the earth itself. It was this intimate knowledge that led her one scorching afternoon to a place where the earth turned traitor, a patch of land that shimmered with a deadly, deceptive wetness, a placid-looking moor that hid a hungry throat. There, swallowed to his chest in the sucking, inexorable embrace of quicksand, was a man. He was a Titan, broad of shoulder and thick of build, his face, beaded with the sweat of a desperate and failing struggle, turning a deathly pale beneath a layer of sun-baked grime. He had ceased his thrashing, a final, grim acknowledgement that he understood the fatal nature of his fight, and a quiet, terrible resignation had settled in his eyes. He was sinking, the land consuming him with a slow, indifferent hunger, pulling him into its depths with the patience of eternity. Leanne moved not with the frantic energy of panic, but with a focused, deliberate calm that was a stark and jarring contrast to the man's silent terror. Panic was a wild animal, a stampeding beast of the heart, and this land did not reward those who let it run free, it preyed upon them. She carried with her always a long, sturdy branch of ironwood, a tool passed down not from her father but from the desert's own sparse generosity, its surface worn smooth by the hands of time and necessity, its weight a familiar comfort in her grasp. Now, it would be a lifeline, a thread of hope cast across a chasm of despair. She laid it upon the solid ground, its length a tangible promise of safety, a declaration that not all the earth was a betrayer. "Do not struggle," she called out, her voice clear and steady, a strange and unexpected music in the oppressive, suffocating silence. The man's eyes, glazed with the fog of exhaustion and encroaching death, flickered towards the sound. Through his haze, he saw a slight, almost ethereal figure, a girl whose resilience was not in her frame but hidden in the quiet, unshakable confidence of her posture. He managed a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a flicker of trust in a world that had just tried to swallow him whole. She worked methodically, her movements economical and sure, anchoring one end of the branch against a collection of heavy, sun-scorched rocks, creating a fulcrum of salvation. Then, slowly, carefully, she pushed the other end out over the mire until it hovered just within his reach. "Take hold," she instructed, her tone leaving no room for argument. His thick, calloused fingers, clumsy with fatigue and slick with mud, wrapped around the gnarled wood. "The earth will only release you if you do not fight it," she explained, her words a mantra against the rising tide of his primal fear. "Pull slowly. Let the sand fill the space you leave behind." It was an agonizingly slow process, a torturous battle of inches fought against an enemy that yielded its ground with a grudging, greedy reluctance. But guided by her calm voice, he began to rise from his premature grave, the thick, wet sand relinquishing its hold with a series of sickening, slurping sounds, like a beast surrendering its prey. Finally, with a great, shuddering gasp that tore from his very soul, he pulled himself free, collapsing onto the solid ground, his massive chest heaving, his body a monument of grey mud and profound exhaustion. He lay there for a long time, a fallen giant upon the parched earth, the sun beating down on his exhausted form, his breath coming in ragged, painful bursts that seemed to count the seconds of his reclaimed life. Leanne brought him water from her good, a small but profound act of grace in the desolate, indifferent landscape. She tilted the good to his lips, and he drank deeply, the cool water a benediction on his tongue, the gratitude in his eyes a more potent thanks than any words he could possibly muster. He was a man of few words, a man whose life was written not in speech but in action, in the hard lines of his face and the calloused strength of his hands. He introduced himself simply as Thorn, a foreman for a vast cattle empire to the north, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. As he slowly regained his strength, he looked at her, truly looked at her, this small woman who had single-handedly pulled him from what should have been his final resting place. He was a man who lived and died by a strict, unwritten code of the West, a code where debts of honor were as real and as binding as any signed contract, as tangible as the earth beneath his feet. A life saved was a debt that could never be truly repaid, but it was a debt that must be acknowledged with a gesture of equal, earth-shaking magnitude. He reached into a small leather pouch on his belt, his thick fingers fumbling with the clasp. He produced a single, heavy iron token, worn smooth with the passage of time, bearing the distinctive, intricate cattle brand of his ranch, a symbol of his identity, his loyalty, his very being. He pressed it into her hand, its weight a strange and solid presence in her palm. "This is a promise," he said, his voice imbued with a solemn, unbreakable gravity. "A life for a life. My people will know what this means. I will return." Leanne accepted the token, feeling its solid, earthy reality. She understood it as a profound token of thanks, a simple, heartfelt gesture from a man of simple, heartfelt principles. She did not, could not, comprehend the depth of the sacred vow he had just made, or the earth-shaking, world-altering consequences of the promise he fully intended to keep. Leanne returned to the small, isolated settlement that was her home, a cluster of wooden structures huddled together in a narrow, protective canyon, a tiny island of the east adrift in a vast, unforgiving ocean of the American West. It was a community of her father's people, railway workers, and their families who had carved out a life here with a quiet, unyielding tenacity, their existence a fragile testament to their endurance in a land that was not always welcoming. She recounted the day's extraordinary events to her father and the assembled elders, presenting the heavy iron token as physical proof of her strange tale. Most listened with a mixture of reverent awe and profound relief, their faces reflecting the gravity of a life saved from the clutches of the land. But one man, Kai, a man whose youth was belied by the age of the suspicion in his eyes, watched the proceedings with a gaze narrowed by a deep and abiding bitterness. Kai was a man whose heart had been hardened into a stone of resentment by the endless prejudice and casual violence his people had so often faced at the hands of the newcomers. He was a zealot in his protection of their small community, a self-appointed guardian who saw threats lurking in every shadow, ill intent hiding behind every outsider's glance. He saw the iron token not as a gift, but as a brand, a mark put upon her, and by extension all of them, by a potential enemy. "You have done a foolish thing," he spat, his voice sharp with a venomous accusation that cut through the respectful silence. "Kindness to a wolf is an invitation to the pack. He knows our location now. This token is not a promise of gratitude, but a marker for his return with others. They will come and take what little we have, as they always do." His words, born of a deep, historical fear, found fertile ground in the hearts of others who had known only hardship and sorrow. A murmur of a new, colder unease rippled through the gathering. Leanne tried to argue, to convey the raw sincerity she had seen in the cowboy's eyes, but Kai's fear, amplified by their collective memory of pain, was a more compelling and persuasive orator. He had planted a seed of doubt that would, in the coming hours, grow into a terrifying, unshakable certainty. Miles away, in a sprawling ranch camp that was a city unto itself, teeming with the raw life and boisterous energy of hundreds of men, Thorn recounted his own version of the story. He stood before his men on the steps of the cook house, his large frame still bearing the streaks of dried grey mud, a visceral testament to his near-fatal ordeal. He spoke of the land's hidden treachery, of the moment he had given himself up for dead, and then he spoke of the quiet, almost mystical girl who had appeared like a spirit of the desert, a guardian angel in human form, to save him. He held up his hand, showing them the empty space in his leather pouch where his foreman's token, his personal seal of honor and authority, used to be. "I have given my mark," he declared, his voice booming with a solemn power that commanded the absolute attention of the assembled crowd of hardened cowboys and weathered ranchers. "A life debt has been made. Such a debt must be answered." His words were not a suggestion, but a command born of a deeply ingrained cultural imperative, a sacred law that governed their lives more surely than any written statute. To his people, a life saved was a holy event, an act of providence that demanded an overwhelming, unambiguous display of gratitude and respect. A small gift, a simple thank you, would be a profound insult to the gravity of the act. The honor of their entire outfit, their entire way of life, was now inextricably tied to repaying this debt in a manner so grand, so monumental, that it could never be questioned. He gave his orders, his voice ringing with purpose. They were not to ride with a few pack mules bearing meager gifts. They were to ride as a full contingent, a formidable procession of honor. 200 men would ride with him at first light. They would bring a dozen of their finest horses, strings of pack mules laden with sacks of flour, with tools and bolts of cloth and crates of precious medicine, a king's ransom of supplies for the isolated community in the canyon. It was to be a magnificent parade of honor, a monumental gesture of thanks from one people to another. But seen from a distance, through the eyes of fear, an army of 200 armed men on horseback looks like only one thing, an invasion. The following morning, as the sun began its slow, majestic ascent, painting the eastern sky in hues of rose and gold, the lookout, a young boy perched high on the canyon rim, saw it first. It was not a rider, not a man, but the sky itself that heralded their approach, a vast and roiling cloud of ochre dust that billowed up from the horizon, a monstrous, churning wave that blotted out the rising sun and seemed to swallow the light. He scrambled down from his precarious post, his face pale with a primal terror, his words tumbling out in a frantic, breathless rush as he burst into the still-sleeping village. Riders! Hundreds of them! They are coming! Panic, the wild animal Leanne had so carefully caged the day before, was now let loose upon her village, a rampaging beast of collective fear. Kai's dark prophecy of doom had come to pass. His voice rose above the frightened cries, sharp and commanding, a rallying cry for a desperate defense. To arms! They have come to destroy us, just as I said. The girl has led them to our door. Men, their faces etched with a mixture of terror and grim resolve, grabbed whatever they could find, old hunting rifles from the last great war, sharpened farming implements that would now taste blood, heavy axes used for clearing timber that would now be used for felling men. They were farmers and laborious, not soldiers, but fear was a powerful crucible, forging them in its fiery heat into a desperate, makeshift militia. They took up positions at the narrow, defensible entrance to the canyon, their faces grim masks, their knuckles showing bone-white as they clutched their crude, unfamiliar weapons. Leanne's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. She saw the dust cloud, she saw the abject terror on the faces of her people, and she saw the terrible, tragic chasm of misunderstanding that was about to swallow them all in a tide of blood and sorrow. She tried to plead with Kai, to make him see that this could not be an attack, but her voice was a whisper drowned out by the rising tide of their war cries. "You are a traitor!" Kai screamed at her, his face contorted into a hideous mask of rage and fear. "You have brought this upon us." She was utterly alone, the bridge between two worlds standing on a precipice, about to witness a catastrophic and unnecessary collision. The thundering of hooves grew louder, a sound like the world's own heart beating a frantic, terrifying rhythm, a percussive announcement of impending doom. It was a sound that shook the very ground, a vibration that resonated deep in the bones, a primal drumbeat of war. Leanne knew, with a certainty that chilled her to her soul, that she could not stay behind the wall of her frightened, angry people. To do so would be to watch two worlds she loved, two parts of her own identity, tear each other apart over a fatal, tragic mistake. With a defiant cry that was both a plea and a challenge, she darted past the armed men who guarded the canyon entrance, their surprised shouts lost in the wind. She ran out onto the open plain, a solitary, determined figure against the vast, empty landscape, a single blade of grass standing against a wildfire. She planted her feet in the dusty soil, directly in the path of the oncoming riders, a human shield armed with nothing but a desperate, flickering hope that reason had not yet been entirely extinguished. The approaching column, a formidable, seemingly endless wave of men and horses, slowed its powerful advance. At its head, Thorn, his eyes scanning the terrain, saw the small, familiar figure standing against them, and behind her, the unmistakable, menacing glint of sunlight on steel from the canyon mouth. He raised a heavy hand, and the entire procession, all 200 men, came to a slow, disciplined halt, the dust settling around them like a shroud. A confused, uncertain murmur ran through his ranks. This was not the welcome he had expected for a mission of such profound honor. He saw the armed villagers, and in his own cultural language, he interpreted their defensive posture as a sign of incomprehensible aggression, a shocking and deadly betrayal of the sacred trust he thought had been forged between himself and their emissary. The air crackled with a lethal tension, a silence stretched taut between the two groups, vibrating with the promise of violence, ready to snap. From the canyon, Kai's voice roared, a desperate, final command, "Get out of the way, girl! Let us die with honor!" But Lian did not move. She held her ground, her gaze locked on the man whose life she had saved, her entire being a silent, desperate, heartbreaking plea for understanding. Thorn swung his massive frame down from his horse, his boots hitting the ground with a solid, decisive thud. In a move that sent a ripple of astonishment through his own men, he unbuckled his heavy gun belt and handed it, along with his reins, to the man beside him. It was a gesture of profound significance, a deliberate act of making himself vulnerable, an incredible act of faith in a situation that was spiraling rapidly towards a bloodbath. He began to walk forward into the charged space between the two forces, his steps slow and deliberate, his hands empty and held open at his sides, a universal sign of peace. He was not a warrior approaching a battlefield, he was a debtor coming to make his payment in the currency of honor. As he drew closer, a silent command passed through his ranks, and his men began to lead forward the strings of pack mules. In the stark, revealing sunlight, the purpose of their visit began to become clearer. The mules were not carrying weapons of war or instruments of plunder, they were laden with life-sustaining supplies, their backs piled high with the very essentials of survival and comfort. Thorn stopped a respectful distance from Lian, his gaze never leaving her face. He ignored the armed men who watched his every move from behind her, his focus entirely on the woman who stood as the sole, fragile barrier to a massacre. "I have come to honor the debt," he said, his deep voice carrying on the still, tense wind, his words not an explanation but a statement of profound, formal gravity. "A life for a life. We have brought gifts to thank your people. We have come in peace." He then gestured to his finest offering, an offering that was meant to be the centerpiece of this grand display, a magnificent, strong-limbed mare, its saddle adorned with intricate, hand-tooled leatherwork, a creature of immense value and breathtaking beauty, a gift worthy of a chieftain, a king. It was a gesture of supreme, unparalleled respect, but one that was still framed by the intimidating, overwhelming presence of 200 armed and ready men. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from. The fate of everyone present, both in the canyon and on the open plain, now rested on a razor's edge, balanced precariously between a fragile peace and a devastating war. Kai and his men remained unconvinced, their weapons still raised, their hearts still pounding with the drumbeat of fear. "It is a deception," he shouted from the canyon mouth, his voice hoarse with the strain of suspicion and terror. "A trick! They mean to lull us into a false security and then strike when our guard is down." The fear was still too strong, the historical memory of violence too deep and too raw to be erased by one man's words, no matter how sincere. But then, a new figure emerged from the canyon entrance, moving through the armed men like a gentle stream parting the reeds. It was Eldershan, the village patriarch, his face a living map of a long life filled with wisdom and hardship, his movement slow but imbued with an unshakable, quiet authority. He had been watching from the shadows, listening to the angry shouts and the honorable declarations, weighing the frantic, justified fear of his people against the strange, formal, and seemingly sincere honor of the newcomers. He walked past Kai, his presence alone silencing the angry, fearful shouts, his silent passage a subtle but clear rebuke of the zealot's path. He came to stand beside Lian, his frail, wrinkled hand resting on her shoulder in a gesture of silent, profound approval and support. He looked at Thorn, and with eyes that had seen the turn of many seasons, he saw not an enemy, but a man bound by a code he was only just beginning to understand. With a grace that defied his age, Eldershan knelt upon the dusty earth and produced a small, simple clay teacup from the folds of his sleeve, a humble vessel used in the most sacred ceremonies of welcome and peace. He offered it to Thorn, his gesture a fragile but powerful bridge across the vast cultural divide. "Your debt is honored," the old man said, his voice quiet but resonant with an undeniable authority that no weapon could challenge. "Accept our hospitality, so that we may honor ours." That simple, profound act, a humble teacup offered in the face of 200 guns, broke the spell of fear that had held everyone in its icy grip. The tension that had stretched the air to its breaking point dissolved like a morning mist under the rising sun. Kai, his face a battlefield of shock, shame, and dawning comprehension, slowly, reluctantly, lowered his rifle. The other men, following his lead, did the same, the sound of their weapons being set down a quiet, collective sigh of relief. Thorn, his own stoic face etched with an immense, palpable relief, knelt to accept the teacup with a nod of the most solemn and heartfelt respect. What began as a terrifying confrontation, a prelude to a massacre, slowly, cautiously, miraculously transformed into a meeting of two peoples. The gifts were unloaded, not as a payment extracted by force, but as a shared bounty, a foundation for a new beginning. The ranchers were invited into the canyon, not as conquerors, but as honored guests. The story of that day became a legend, a founding myth for a new era of peace and cooperation between the settlers of the plains and the people of the canyon. Trade routes were established, mutual protection pacts were formed, and lasting friendships were forged over shared meals and shared stories. The cultural chasm that had once seemed impossibly wide was bridged by courage and wisdom. Lian, once an outsider caught between two worlds, became the respected heart of both, her name a symbol of courage celebrated in the boisterous stories of the ranchers and the quiet, reverent songs of her own people. She had proven that understanding is a more powerful weapon than fear, and that a single act of compassion, however small and seemingly insignificant, can be enough to change the course of history, turning a potential battlefield into a field of lasting peace. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel for more tales that inspire and uplift.